All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Ginger Wireman. I am a community outreach and environmental education specialist with the Nuclear Waste Program at the Department of Ecology in Richland. We are on the traditional territories of the Yakima people at Hanford, but in the Tri-Cities, we also are on the territories of the Walla Walla, Cayuse, Umatilla, Nez Perce, and Palouse people in our general surroundings. So I want to acknowledge that those people lived here first and they are still around. And tonight we are excited to do our Let's Talk About Hanford conversation and talk about Hanford wildlife and habitat. And with us, we have Jason Fidorra with Washington Fish and Wildlife Service. Hey, Jason. And Trina Staloch with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I hope
that should be Trina.
Trina, I'm sorry. You're right, Trina. I'm sorry. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Is it Staloch or Staloch? Oh,
it's Staloch. It's tricky.
Oh, well, welcome. Why don't we let you folks introduce yourselves? How about ladies first, Trina?
Sure, absolutely. Welcome, everybody. My name is Trina Staloch. I'm the Deputy Project Leader at Central Washington National Wildlife Refuge Complex, located in Burbank, Washington. We manage 3 national wildlife refuges in addition to the Hanford Reach Monument, Convoy Lake National Wildlife Refuge, up near Glenwood, Washington, Toppenish National Wildlife Refuge near Toppenish, and Columbia National Wildlife Refuge near Othello, in addition to the monument. So excited to be here and share with all of you. Thanks.
Great. And Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason Fidorra. I'm with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm based in Pasco as the wildlife biologist for Benton and Franklin counties. And WDFW mission is to conserve and protect the species of Washington, as well as balancing sustainable recreational use and commercial use of those resources. At Hanford, we're a trustee partner and collaborate a lot with Department of Energy and the contractors on wildlife surveys and conservation actions, as well as with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and their staff at the monument. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Great. And I'm going to hand it off briefly to my colleague, Ryan Miller, who will go over some housekeeping.
Yeah, hi, everyone. It's good to be back. This is our 5th Let's Talk About Hanford event, and we're excited this time to partner with both Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So again, thanks to Jason and Trina for joining us today. So before we go into the presentation tonight, I'd like to go over the housekeeping stuff that I go over in all of our events. So we're going to start off the event with a presentation by Jason and Trina around Hanford's habitat and wildlife, and following that we'll move into a live question and answer session with everybody that's attending tonight. So with that being said, as you know, our events that we've been holding are more high level. They're geared towards those who are new around Hanford, or might only know one particular part about Hanford, and or those who want refreshers. But we'd like to remind that for your questions that you ask live tonight, that you gear them towards Hanford habitat and wildlife, specifically in the Hanford Reach. Trina and Jason's area of expertise is the wildlife and habitat in the Hanford Reach, and not Hanford's like cleanup specifically. So with that being said, we'll do our best to answer any questions you have, but we would like you to gear your questions specifically towards Hanford habitat and wildlife, since that's the experts we have on tonight. If there's any questions that we can answer tonight, we commit to following up over email if you provide us an email, so you can feel free to email us your questions at hanford@ecy.wa.gov for any questions that we can't answer tonight. Along the same lines, if our event runs long tonight and we can't get to all of the live questions, we will also commit to following up the blog with any other Hanford habitat and wildlife questions that are asked that we just don't have time to get to in the event that we get too many questions. So I guess with that being said, we'll go ahead and kick it over to Jason and Trina, and we can start our presentation tonight.
Sounds good. So I'm starting. Ryan, I'm not seeing the presentation on this screen. I don't know, maybe. Oh, there we go.
Oh, there it goes. You just took a minute.
Perfect. And I'm just waiting for it to be into slideshow mode. Okay. And I'm going to apologize up front. I've got the onset of a cold, so if I've got to cough, I'll quick hit the mute button. But hopefully we can make it through without any difficulties. So again, my name is Trina Staloch. I'm the Deputy Project Leader here at Central Washington National Wildlife Refuge Complex, which manages the Hanford Reach, in addition to the 3 additional refuges. Next slide. All right, so a quick overview. As Ryan mentioned, we're going to touch on a number of wildlife and wildlife habitat topics to help share more about the monument and this vast landscape. Here's a list, generally speaking, of the topics that we'll cover at a bigger picture level tonight. Next slide. Establishment of the monument. You may know this, but in June of 2000, President Bill Clinton established the monument through presidential proclamation. If you haven't seen the document, it's actually an incredibly neat piece of work. It details a lot of the natural heritage in this area, as well as the history, while establishing the monument. It discusses how this is the last free-flowing non-tidal stretch of the Columbia. It also touches on how the monument contains one of the last remaining large blocks of a shrubstep ecosystem in the Columbia River Basin, which supports an unusually high diversity of native plant and animal species, as well as a significant breeding populations of nearly all steppe and shrubstep dependent birds, some of which are the logger-headed shrike, sage sparrow, the sage thrasher, and the ferruginous hawk. Next slide. Partnerships in wildlife while managing Hanford Reach. Hanford Reach National Monument is roughly 195,000 acres. Of that, Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for managing roughly 165,000 acres. That is a huge landscape. If it weren't for our valuable partners here, we wouldn't be able to manage what we do. So leaning on experts like Jason and our partners at Department of Energy, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers, our local Washington universities, as well as Oregon universities, are all important in contributing to our success on the landscape within the monument. Next slide, and I'll pass it over to Jason.
Okay, thanks, Trina. As mentioned in the proclamation, this area provides a lot of shrubstep habitat and species. And I just want to provide a little bit of overview of shrubstep real quick. Next slide. And basically start with the definition of, what is shrubstep? And it's not really a complicated term. Can you hit the next slide here, Dana? Shrubstep by itself is basically an ecosystem with dominant overstory of shrubs. In our area, it's typically sagebrush, bitterbrush, and rabbit brush and some other species, interspersed with steppe, which is basically just grassland of native bunch grasses, interspersed with forbs and a cryptobiotic crust. Unfortunately, one of the, can you go back a slide? I think we skipped something. Well, in any case, the status of shrubstep, okay, so yeah, so status of shrubstep in Washington. We're really fortunate to have this protected area, both the central Hanford and the surrounding monument, to protect shrubstep in Washington, because since over the past last couple hundred years, we've had a dramatic loss of shrubstep in our area. At least 60% of shrubstep in Washington has been converted. Other estimates estimate that there's only 12% intact shrubstep remaining. So depending how you define it, we're down to a loss of 88%. It was a dominant ecosystem across the entire Columbia Basin prior to European settlement of the region. And since then, there's been a major loss of agricultural development, which was the primary conversion factor, and more recently increased urbanization and sprawl, degradation through ranching, overgrazing, and fire. Next slide. So just kind of show you a little broader, the lime green color there is the what we classify as shrubstep remaining in Washington. A lot of that brown color would have been native shrubstep. And the location of the Hanford site, you know, with the Columbia Basin extending south into Oregon off this map, kind of sits at the heart of this ecosystem in eastern Washington and Oregon. And it provides important connective landscape across species in the region, and its juxtaposition close to the Yakima Training Center to the west means that we basically have this core protected area. However, as I mentioned, a lot of what's still defined as shrubstep is continually degrading. Next slide. And one of the major threats to the area, I don't know if I have a lag or maybe should be one more slide. There we go. As I mentioned, is fire. This is just a map of recent fires in Washington over the past 20 years. You can see that they're predominantly focused in areas of shrubstep. Shrubstep's certainly an endangered ecosystem in Washington, and its role with fire on the recent increase of fire is dramatically furthering the reduction of its value as wildlife habitat. The main cause for this, next slide, is kind of can be confusing. Fire is a natural part of ecosystems. The fire cycle historically would have been a fire regime of lightning strikes. That a fire regime is basically the time between fires return to a landscape. So you may have a patch of shrubstep and it would burn how often? In absence of human activity, it's estimated to be 50 to, I've seen some estimates closer to several hundred years of fire intervals, a natural fire interval. And Shrubstep adapted with this fire regime, and fire plays an integral part in it having a varied successional kind of state. You can have places that fires historically would have been small and fairly infrequent, while sagebrush itself is very fire intolerant. Once it's burnt, it generally doesn't regrow. It doesn't, send up runners or anything like that, or sprouts out of the burnt stalk. Typically, a burnt sagebrush plant dies. But the system has other defensive adaptations, being that there's a healthy, intact shrubstep ecosystem, has a lot of bare or appearingly bare ground in between the vegetation. This bare ground is basically a cryptobiotic crust that's really alive with a diverse ecosystem of its own, of lichens, mosses, algae, and small wildflowers and species adapted to the ecosystem really rely upon that. It also prevents wildfire from moving over a vast area. Similarly, the native bunch grasses would have been interspersed in a way that prevents wildfire from spreading quickly. However, more recently, there's been an increased soil disturbance and invasive species that have resulted in a change to the fire regime. Next slide. And cheatgrass, as well as some other invasive annual grasses and plants, have really driven the fire cycle locally. Estimates indicate that now we're looking at a fire interval, instead of 50 to hundreds of years, we're talking about 7 years in between burns of some areas. And that's not long enough time to allow sagebrush and the native shrub component to regenerate and restore function. So what we end up with in areas that burn frequently is a reduction of shrubs, increased invasion of cheatgrass, which basically dries out early, creates a flammable, dense carpet, restricts other things from growing back naturally in native plants, and is flammable and can carry fire over larger areas. So we have these big mono culture style landscapes of cheatgrass in some areas that have burned frequently. And I think we'll talk next about fire on Hanford more specifically. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So how are fires caused on the monument? Taking a look at the map on the right, Jason hit the nail on the head. Fires on our within this landscape are primarily human caused, and from a number of different sources. So we're seeing our fire season is essentially from May through September, depending on the year. And causes can come from agricultural burns to folks burning debris. But if you look at the map, there's Highway 240 that runs to would be the northeast side of our rattlesnake unit. And then there's Highway 24 that bisects the northern unit, Saddle Lake, as well as Luke. And so we also get a fair amount of starts from vehicles who are pulling off the highway, parking over dry vegetation and pulling away, not realizing that they may have started fire. Chains that are dragging and was creating sparks. That is primarily how the fires start on the Hanford Reach Monument. Now, if you take a look at the photo in the upper left, that shows, I think that's from this year, a fire that we had on the monument at one point in time. You also might be able to see, if you look closely, there's a fence line in the background. Just on the other side of that fence line is a fuel break. We use mitigating tools like fuel breaks to help keep fires on this landscape as small and as minimal as possible. Without those fuel breaks, we would continue to have much larger fires more frequently. In addition, we at Central have a phenomenal team of trained fire professionals who are responsible for planning, coordinating, and responding to wildfires. We've got a team of roughly 20 to 25 folks who are all trained in wildland fire suppression efforts. In addition to them, we work closely with the volunteer fire departments as well as our partners in working to address wildfires on the landscape and keeping it as minimal as possible. Next slide, Jason.
All right, we're going to get to some of the more fun stuff here. And Dana, if you just want to kind of click through these, I've got a photo for each one that comes in. So we're not going to talk about all these species today. We've got a few that we have a little more focus on that we'll hit, but some of the species of the shrubstep and monument that we're going to talk about or that exist on the monument. American badger, you can hold up a minute, Dana. American badger are out there. Rocky Mountain elk and mule deer. Do want to stress there, we currently don't have any public hunting or any hunting on the refuge, but they exist out there. Driving down 240 during the winter time. A lot of people don't know we have elk here, but the best time to see them is in the winter along 240 and look out of the flats kind of at the base of Rattlesnake Mountain, and you should see herds out there. Nope. We have one of the largest bat maternity colonies in Washington is present on Central Hanford, and we work with Department of Energy and partners to sample for white nose syndrome there, and as well as keeping colony counts. The other species we're going to talk about a little bit further, Townsend's ground squirrel, pictured here, yellow-bellied marmot. You can keep moving now, Dana. Thanks. Yellow-bellied marmot, ferruginous hawk, burrowing owl, black-tailed jackrabbit is another species of concern. And I want to mention that the partners at Department of Energy and their contractors, they do put out reports that highlight some of their efforts in monitoring and conservation on Central Hanford. The black-tailed jackrabbit picture and several of these pictures are borrowed from some of those reports. So I wanted to mention that. You can find those through some search engines. Sagebrush sparrow, one of the obligates mentioned in the monuments proclamation, really dependent on intact the old growth shrubstep with higher densities of sagebrush, as similar to the sagebrush lizard, pygmy shorthorned lizard, and Great Basin spadefoot are some of the cool amphibians that partners out there have been surveying and are just cool parts of our ecosystem. So getting a little more detail here, I'll talk about ferruginous hawk. Both U.S. Fish and Department of Energy partners have worked with the state to conduct statewide inventories for ferruginous hawk nesting territories. This species is a mammal specialist. It specializes on preying on species like our ground squirrels, jackrabbits, cottontails, as well as other small mammals. It's the largest buteo, which is basically a genus of hawks in North America. So it's our largest hawk species. And they're primarily present in Washington during the breeding season, which starts in March, and for a short period of time afterwards into August before they start their migration, which I'll talk about shortly. And unfortunately, it's recently been uplisted in Washington to endangered based on the long-term decline of the species across the area, but it is still a present breeding species of Hanford site. Next slide. And this just shows some of the statewide survey data over the past several years. There's another survey we did last year that kind of continues this trend of declining number of occupied territories and nesting pairs in the state. Next. Just a little bit on identification. It's really hard to tell that it's larger than the more common red tail, but it does typically have a lighter head. Red tails are typically very brown capped, and it has a really large, notable orange-yellow gape, which is basically the line extending from the back of the bill and the cere there at the base of the bill, which can be visible if it goes underneath the eye. That gape is a good indication of a ferruginous hawk. That rust-colored tone is typical of most of our light morph birds here in the area, and the legs are feathered all the way down to the toes. Next. But to make things tricky, they do come in all different kind of color morphs, and from black to almost all white. Typical are the lighter morphs and the intermediate morph there in the middle. Next. As a nesting species, these birds make large nests, typically primarily of large dead pieces of sagebrush. So these are usually placed on cliffs or rock outcroppings, or occasionally in isolated trees where they have kind of a commanding view of the surrounding landscape. They're shrubstep specialists. On the Hanford site, however, most of the nesting attempts and successes are on special platforms that were installed on the high tension power lines that run across the site. And you can see here These platforms had some sticks added at the beginning to indicate to the birds it's a nesting site, and birds add additional nest material year after year. So the longer the nest has been in use, the taller and higher the nest becomes. And you can see some, these were some successful years with juveniles photographed in the nest. Next. Again, this is a range in Washington. Most of the species range has contracted. The blue dots are old nest sites in Klickitat in Yakima County to the west pretty much are no longer occupied, and the species is contracted in Benton County, and the Hanford site held some of the only nests left in Benton County, while Franklin County and Walla Walla County kind of maintain the core range. Next. Just some interesting information we've learned over the years with Regenus hawks is they kind of partake in a three-step migration. Instead of an annual migration from a breeding range to a wintering range, they have an added step here where in Washington, as I said, they're present from March until August. Next. After, where they're foraging on our native Townsend's ground squirrels, Washington ground squirrels. In the fall, they disperse and primarily head northeast over the Continental Divide into the prairie states, southern Canada, where they're going to forage on the available Richardson ground squirrels and the prairie dogs out there. Next. And then finally, they make a winter migration. Once those animals once winter sets in and the prey availability decreases, they move to a final winter range in California, where they have species like California ground squirrel to forage on, and they spend the rest of the winter there until March when they move back to Washington. Next slide. So as you can see, Townsend's ground squirrels are species native to our area, extremely important as prey for Regenus hawk, but also for various other species. Badgers are typically ground squirrel specialists. And the Townsend's ground squirrel is a species of ground squirrel that we have native to Benton County on the Hanford site. If you're in Franklin County on the other side of the river, you'd have a chance of finding Washington's ground squirrels, which look pretty similar. Next. This shows the range of the Townsend's ground squirrel. It's a candidate species in Washington, so it's not listed as threatened or endangered, but it's a species that may be warranted as threatened or endangered if conditions don't improve. Interestingly, they're present. They come out of their burrows typically early spring or late winter, anywhere from January to February, depending on the year, and snow levels. March and higher elevation sites or bad snow years, and they feed on all of the green up and forbs present. Once things dry out and the hills turn brown again and the plants all dry out, they tend to estivate underground, and they can go under as early as May, typically by June, and then they'll move into hibernation over the winter. So they're really only out on the landscape for 3 to 5 months of the year, which makes them kind of hard to study and detect. But they are an important prey species, as we mentioned. They also play a role as a seed disperser. They aerate soil, and they create these burrows that can be used by other species as habitat that we'll talk about a little bit next. On the Hanford site, they've done some various surveys with DOE and contractors, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife. This is from one of the reports conducted showing just some habitat modeling they've done to identify suitable sites for ground squirrels on the Hanford site. Our partners there are working with us on some genetic studies. There's debate about some of the subspecies, as well as some authorities. There's just some taxonomic questions in the ground squirrels in general, and we're collecting opportunistic samples there with the contractors and DOE. And in the future, DOE is looking to do some experimental translocations to augment the population using some of the information that we've gained from U.S. Fish and WDFW efforts with Washington ground squirrels. Next slide. So Washington ground squirrels, which this is an image of at one of the artificial burrow sites that was constructed within release pens, where basically similar to what we do with pygmy rabbits in other parts of Washington, they construct these artificial burrow networks, introduce several ground squirrels and have predator protective fencing around the colony and try to encourage them to maintain a population on site. And it's been really successful with Washington ground squirrels on some sites. So hopefully we'll see that success in the future on Hanford. Next. And I'll pass it back to Trina.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm going to touch real quickly on yellow-bellied marmots. They are very similar to the ground squirrels that Jason detailed before in the fact that they help loosen and aerate the soil. They also help in seed dispersal and are prey for the other species out on the landscape. You may have seen yellow-bellied marmots in urban environments. They tend to be looked upon as a pest, whether they're creating havoc in your yard or to vehicles, but they are an important component on the Shrubstep for a number of different reasons, one of which I'll touch on here shortly. But habitat for the yellow-bellied marmots is within eastern Washington at lower elevations. You may have, if you hike in the mountains, you may have seen their relative, the hoary marmot, and they are thought to have previously existed on parts of Hanford. Next slide, please. Project planning. So one of the important aspects of the marmot is the fact that they are ground-dwelling mammals, and they will dig burrows, which also support a different suite of species in the Shrubstep ecosystem as well. In 2009, our staff at the Fish and Wildlife Service completed what we would call a hard release, where we captured marmots from nuisance sites within Tri-Cities area and release them in suitable habitat out on the monument. Suitable habitat consisted of open sagebrush steppe, also with logs, log piles that would provide cover for these species. Unfortunately, it was not successful, but we're currently in the planning stages, working to capture and release marmots again out on the monument, this time including a protective enclosure to keep them protected from prey. And again, being an important mammal on the landscape, potentially providing additional burrows for another suite of species. Next slide. The western burrowing owls. Jason mentioned them early on as well. They are an adorable, very charismatic and quirky owl species. They're small owls found in arid and semi-arid environments. They're anywhere from 9 to 11 inches tall. Both the males and the females weigh less than a half a pound. They've got bare legs. Their bodies are brown with white speckles, yellow irises, and a really curious single eyebrow. And as I mentioned, they utilize mammal burrows or cavities surrounded by sparse vegetation, which again is an important to highlight because of what Jason mentioned about the ground squirrels and the marmots. Each of these species complement each other. They rely, like I mentioned, on mammal burrows and cavities for nesting. They begin nesting sometime around April, May, where the female will lay an egg roughly once every other day until she has her full clutch of eggs. They'll incubate for roughly a month, and then the eggs will hatch about the same time that they were laid. So somewhat sporadically, they'll have some eggs as well as some owls, new hatchlings within the nest. Next slide.
All right, so for this one, we're going to do a little swap-a-roozy. I'm going to try and pull up my slides since Dana's having some technical issues. So give us 1 second here.
Yep. While Ryan's putting that together, One thing to think about is when you hear the video in the background, ask yourself what's making that noise.
All right, let's see if we got this working.
Fantastic. Yeah, that was great. Perfect.
Awesome. I can do it one more time too for anybody that missed it.
Yeah. Great. You want to expose the photo below? Look at that. How neat is that? Many wildlife species learn different adaptations to protect themselves as young. In an environment with rattlesnakes, burrowing owls, burrowing owl young sound like the rattle on a snake as a defense mechanism for potential predators. When we were setting this up, I think it was Jason made the comment, imagine reaching your hand down a cavity or a hole and hearing that in return. Cute. To touch on their status, burrowing owls within Washington. This comes from a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service report done in early 2000s, identifying their distribution on the eastern side of Washington. As you can see, it's around the Tri-Cities area, and a little further north is the greatest concentration of burrowing owls. Federally, they are listed as a species of concern. And within Washington, they are listed as a candidate species for listing as endangered, threatened, or sensitive. Their population has declined over the last 10-15 years, seeing significant losses in places like the Dakotas and Montana. The biggest threat to burrowing owls is the loss of their historic nesting sites. One of the things with burrowing owls is they have a strong site fidelity to their burrows, which means they want to come back every year to the same burrows. They typically have a single nesting burrow and utilize satellite burrows, whether it's for a food cache or roosting. So having more than just one burrow is important for burrowing owls. The lifespan of a burrow on this landscape is roughly 3 years, which isn't very long. So again, as burrowing owls want to come back to the same sites every year, and they're finding their nests destroyed, they have to look elsewhere. Next slide. So how we're managing that on Hanford Reach National Monument when it comes to the burrowing owls. In 2010, our wildlife biologist Heidi Newsom installed 16 burrow sites, and to date, with the exception of a few of those sites on a few years, they are used annually by burrowing owls. As you can see, the long black PVC pipe is quote unquote the burrow that the owl will utilize to go down into its cavity. You can kind of see it, but it looks like the top of a blue barrel. I believe there is a wire mesh below that too to help any potentially burrowing predators to keep them from getting into the burrow. And then on the top of it, you'll see a white bucket, which is utilized as access for us to help maintain the burrows and conduct our annual surveys. So we've got 16 sites on the monument, which each site consists of 3 burrows. There is a nesting burrow, there is a food cache, and a roosting burrow. In addition to those 16, this year, our wildlife biologist, Sherry Whitfield, coordinated an additional 8 sites, 24 burrows on the monument to complement what's currently out there. We're continuing to monitor and ban annually at both sites And we've already seen some success with the new burrows that we added. They were added in July to help the new juvenile owls as they begin to migrate away from their current home burrows. They'll discover the new ones. Do you want to click one time? I think it'll show the photo. Yes. So this is a photo that Sherry sent me, and as you can, well, I think you can see, depends on how big your screen is, but there are some feathers to the right of the burrow as well as some scat in front of it, indicating that this site has been used. And again, being one of the new burrows, this is really great, fantastic to see. Next, there we go. Yes, and these are a couple of burrowing owls out on the Hanford Reach Monument, successfully hanging out at one of their burrows. And that is it, I think, for the presentation. Again, I want to thank everybody. We're here for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jason and Trina. That was really informative. I find with these Let's Talk About Hanford presentations, I'm learning tons of new stuff at every one of these we do. With that being said, let's go ahead and move into the live Q&A session. So I'll remind everybody that's listening, whether you're on WebEx or on the Facebook chat, if you have any questions for Jason and Trina, feel free to put them into the chat box on WebEx or into the the comment feed on the Facebook live stream. So we'll go ahead and start off with a pre-submitted question we actually had a few weeks ago. This question was submitted by Mike. Mike asked, I'd like to know if the size of the elk herd on the AL is still a problem and what, if anything, is being done to manage it. Allowing hunting is an obvious solution, but that is not permissible due to the needs of the research. What other options are available?
Unless you want to take this one, Trina, I can just give a little bit of an update. There is still a herd on the Hanford site. It's currently well over objective. Last full formal count during the winter was approximately 1,600 animals. And that includes Central Hanford, private land surrounding, and Rattlesnake Mountain. We're still working with partners, including Department of Energy, U.S. Fish and Tribes, to come up with a workable solution to kind of improve management of that herd. Like you said, right now hunting is an option on the federal lands. We do a fair amount of management of hunters and try to improve access on private lands where elk are damaging the surrounding private property and crops. So we are working on that as a department. And right now there is some new efforts looking at research. We're doing DOE contractors are flying to do some surveys to help understand some of the movement patterns. They might be doing some collaring of elk in the future, and that'll all help feed into some ideas that we can perhaps use to manage the herd a little more efficiently in the future. But definitely a sticky situation and not resolved yet.
Let's see.
Yeah, great, Jason. Go ahead.
Did you want to add anything, Trina?
Nope, just that we've been working in partnership with the state as well as DOE and our other partners on how to address it. It's just one of those complicated issues, and I think COVID has really slowed things down as well too.
Sure. Okay, so from the Facebook, we've got from Carl, are there dose rate studies of the wildlife? And is there any weighted risk information that we know from studying the Hanford Reach, perhaps what wildlife numbers mean to humans?
What was that? One more time, Ginger. I didn't catch the first part.
Are there dose rate studies, like how much radiation does the wildlife get? And is there any weighted risk information that we know from studying the Hanford Reach and what it might mean for humans? And I'm going to step away and put my dog in a different room.
Yeah, Jason, I don't know if you have a better answer for this one, but I don't think there's anything that I know of.
There are studies, the DOE kind of has that information, and it's likely available. I couldn't speak to it offhand. There are annual reports put out that do cover some of these topics. They do collect samples from the wildlife annually, and I'd have to look at the report, but they should be able to find the annual report online. But I don't have the information offhand.
Yeah, I can interject there, Jason. I have actually got a link here I'm going to put into the chat on both Facebook and WebEx, and that links you to the, I believe this is the correct link, it links you to the Hanford site annual environmental reports. So I'm going to put that into the chat here on both Facebook and the WebEx chats. And we also had, so our next question comes from Dan Solitz. He asked one earlier on, and he said, hypothetical question. If you magically removed all of the vegetation from a random 100 acres of the Hanford Shrubstep, what would be better, natural revegetation or human replanting?
I could give my opinion. I mean, just in general, with the noxious weeds and the wind-blown kind of environment that we have here, with the amount of invasive species, I think, you know, that typically is what happens when we have some of these hot fires. All the vegetation is removed, and what we're seeing replace it is the non-native invasive cheatgrasses, tumble mustards, and other annual weeds that just perpetuate the fire cycle. So it really takes some heavy-handed restoration to get intact shrubstep back on the ground. So it's a good question, though. Good thought exercise.
Yeah, I agree. If it's left open and undisturbed on the monument, Jason's right. Cheatgrass moves right in. Invasives tend to take over rather than native vegetation. In the short term, right? Who knows? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the soil is the big issue too, because once the soil's disturbed, the soil crusts are so important to the whole ecosystem. So we'll have another show sometime in the future about just the cryptogamic crust, I'm sure.
Really great.
How about this was Ryan, for some reason I can't see how many other questions there are on my view of the Facebook page, so I'm going to go with some of the pre-recorded questions. What do you know about the eagle nesting population, and is there a project that tracks them through either of your agencies?
Ooh, Jason, that might be you too. I don't know about that.
We do have documented eagle nests around Tri-Cities, as well as in the Hanford Reach, and there's probably some I don't know about. They do annual raptor surveys on Central Hanford, and possibly on the monument, I'm not sure. But they target nesting raptors, so they're looking for more than just eagles. In our system in interior, hang on a sec. In our system here in Eastern Washington, we actually see the largest influx of eagles during the winter, where birds are moving from the coast and coming to these free-flowing sections of the river, and we can get dozens to hundreds in our area during the winter time. So that's actually the best time to see eagles. But the bald eagle, because of its success as a species, its recovery since DDT and being listed, it's no longer listed in Washington. So DFW has actually taken a step back from working with bald eagles specifically, though they are still federally protected.
Awesome, thank you for that. Trina, do you have anything to add, or do you want to move on to the next one? Okay, so you're shaking your head. All right, so this question came earlier from Carl, and it was kind of answered briefly by myself and WDFW in the chat, but he just said, so it's not a toxic wasteland, isn't Hanford? So short answer is no, it's not a toxic wasteland. I'll echo what the Fish and Wildlife account said that it's a very rich area for wildlife. And Ginger, you might have a better number than I do. I remember I got a rough estimate sometime last year, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But I mean, a vast majority of the Hanford site doesn't have, cleanup related or Hanford site related stuff on it. It's all just a bunch of nature and the Shrubstep ecosystem, and it's the vast majority is kind of untouched by Hanford related stuff. But Ginger, do you have any comments you want to add on to what I said?
Yeah, the there were lots of random, when the agencies started regulating the Hanford site and cleaning it up, when EPA and ecology got in there, they inventoried about 2,400 unique waste sites are just around, but all of the little random dumping sites and things have been cleaned up. And the stat that we use is only about 10% of the Hanford site has any kind of contamination or active cleanup work going on. So it's 586 square miles on the Hanford site. And then what did you say? 100,000 acres, which I can't convert the acres to miles in my head, but between the site and the monument, that's a lot of land, although a lot of it's degraded. And just something that's probably important to note is that if there is any residual radiation in the soil, they actually don't revegetate that area because they don't want to encourage burrowing species to come back in and start burrowing and spreading it around if they somehow haven't been able to clean it up. So they try to keep those areas sterile on purpose. I'm looking at Carl's little tiny icons because I'm trying to look at him. Anyway, they try to keep it discourage wildlife from getting into any areas where there might still be radioactive material.
And I guess I could add on to that just a little bit of I guess this is a plug for, the Hanford National Monument was really, I don't know if that was included in that percentage that you mentioned there, Ginger, but I mean, that area was pretty minorly, it was more of a buffer area surrounding the Hanford activities. And while the rattlesnake unit is off limits to public access, we really have a great local treasure of the Saddle Mountain unit up to the north side of the Reach. And that's publicly accessible. There's a White Bluffs boat launch there that has a hiking trail up into some awesome sand dunes. And you can drive up to the ridge of Saddle Mountain in most cars. And then I know they've had you can see firsthand the difference of areas that have burned and not burned in the Shrubstep, but there are some great views up there, and you can get on to this property in area safely to just see some of that species that are out there. So I'd encourage that as well.
Yeah, no, that's great, Jason, too, to touch on. The 195,000 acres is surrounding Central Hanford, which, from what I understand, is outside of that, the acres that you were detailing, Ginger. And high five, Jason, for touching on the public use aspects of Hanford, too. Woo! Yeah. It would a car could make it up to Saddle Mountain for sure, but the road is it's a white knuckler, but it's one of the best vantage points that I have seen within the Columbia River Valley. So yeah, you're invited to check it out. It's beautiful. You can see upwards towards potholes. It's all the way south here towards Tri-Cities. It's beautiful.
Awesome. Love the comments there, Jason and Trina and Ginger. So I know, Ginger, you're having some issues with seeing the Facebook comments, so I can take another one. This question came from Susan Leckband. Hi, Susan. It says, do you test the owls and other animal species for any uptakes of radiation and chemicals? I know we kind of touched on that a little bit with that one question earlier, but do you guys have anything else to add to that question?
Gosh, I don't know that I saw that in any of the reports that I've read as far as our annual survey. Jason, I know you were a part of the bigger owl group. Do you know if any of the folks a part of those partnerships did any of the testing? I didn't see anything.
So I'd reference, I know that there are a suite of species that are tested. I do not believe owls would be, however, they may have been tested opportunistically if there was a roadkill or something. But in general, I just steer everyone to, there is I think if people can see the chat, there is a link, or it'll come out in maybe the blog post, some reference materials about the testing of wildlife on the site. Typically, though, I mean, on Central Hanford, things are usually pretty well monitored, just from working with them. No biotic material and stuff leaves the site without being tested for radiation and things like that. So But I don't know that they've done anything with owls specifically, but they do test other vertebrates and species out there.
Ginger, you're muted.
Yeah. So you mentioned the size of the elk herd, and we've discussed that it's not suitable for or open to the public. And I'm curious, there's a question about, do you have any idea, or has there been any discussion about, like how many years from now might there be a discussion on public hunting, or what are the biggest barriers to allowing a public hunt?
Well, it's fairly complicated, and I don't know the answer. There are ongoing discussions. We do work. There's been several. We do have ongoing discussions with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and DOE. I think right now what we're looking at is, and the tray a part in that. One of the challenges is the benefit that the Rattlesnake Mountain is a declared, I'm going to not know the right terminology for it, but it's an important archaeological site and cultural site for the region's tribes. It limits, it puts restraints on access and things that we can do out there. But at the same time, it's, protects this amazing area. So we're working, like I said, I guess in short, I don't know. Is maybe the best answer.
Well, I'll just add a little bit. I used to hang out with people from the weed board, and they talked about that one of the concerns too was that even if we decided to do a small hunt, people would have to bring vehicles in to bring their kill out. And the risk of introducing weeds on dirty vehicles was considered not worth it. So that was a conversation I heard about 10 or 15 years ago. So there's a lot involved. And of course, the tribes should have a lot of say in what's decided.
So thank you, Ginger. So this next question comes from Joan on Facebook, and Joan asks, you mentioned cooperating agencies and tribal groups. Are farmers and ranchers on board as well?
Is that in regards to something specific, or just in general how we cooperate on the monument?
I think that's just in general from my understanding of the question.
Yeah. So I started here in April of 2020, and I've built relationships with some of our ranching community around the monument. So they're included. We connect with them too. It just depending on the topic. Maybe not necessarily in specific management actions. But yeah, we do include our local neighbors and partners just in the general communication on the monument. Jason, I don't know if you have got more to add to that too.
Yeah, I can actually give an example of something we've been working on to the west of the monument. There's a gap between the Yakima Training Center and the monument that I mentioned. It's kind of the mostly private land, and we've been working with landowners in that area on specially designed fire breaks that are comprised of, it's called a green strip or vegetated fire break that'll actually have more drought tolerant species in a mix that landowners are implementing on their property to serve as a fuel break to help stop the wind driven fires, or at least slow them to that help control them. And so we're working with the private landowners on that. We're working with them on maximizing and opportunistic opportunities for, elk management and other things like that. So, in general, then we at least try to include them, and they've been very supportive, at least in many of the.
right, thanks, Jason. I think we lost you a little bit there at the end, but I think we still caught basically 99% of what you said. Before we take in more questions, I'll just add that if anybody has any questions for Jason and Trina, feel free to stick them in the Facebook stream chat or the WebEx chat if you have any more questions for Jason and Trina. But so with that being said, I think we still have a couple more questions. Ginger, do you want to ask our next one?
Sure. Tim asked, are there places with public access to, and you may not want to answer this question, to be able to see and photograph the burrowing owls? You give him a general transect and then he has to figure it out so that we don't bug him too much.
Yeah, our burrowing owl burrows are on our rattlesnake unit, which is not open to the public, unfortunately. So I don't know that there's a convenient spot close enough where you could take a picture. They're off the highway, a fairways, so you'd have to have a pretty intense magnifying lens to take a photo of them from the road. Jason, I don't know if you know of any other potentially local spots that might be available for folks to see or photograph burrowing owls.
I turned my video off because of my internet quality. But yeah, I mean, most of the, we do have partners with artificial burrows, trying to increase habitat, not just on the monument, central Hanford burrows. I'm working with private landowners on burrow sites as well, artificial burrows. And unfortunately, there just aren't a lot of places where we see burrowing owls occurring in the numbers that they used to before. I hear stories of, most of Eastern Pasco out by the King City area, you could drive around and see burrowing owls on the side of the road or up on fence lines and things like that. And we've lost most of those burrows. Burrowing mammals aren't like badgers, aren't as prevalent so close to the city anymore and have faced their own persecutions in the past. And so we just don't have a lot of natural burrow sites anymore. And the ones that we do are kind of placed off of public access for their own benefit. So there's nowhere to really get too close to them that I'm aware of.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason and Trina. So I think we're starting to wind down. I haven't seen any, super new questions in the chat. So we'll just give a last call for everybody. If anybody has any questions for Jason and Trina about Hanford Wildlife and Habitat, feel free to stick them in the WebEx chat or the Facebook chat. And we'll, I'm sure Ginger and I could scrounge up a question or two to ask them just to give everybody else time to. Oh, actually here, Debbie just came in and asked a question. Debbie asks, how are the marmots doing on site?
Thanks, Debbie. Actually, the release from 2009 was unsuccessful. I don't believe we have 80 marmots currently out on the monument. The goal is to partner with folks in the Tri-Cities who have nuisance marmots, capture and release those in an enclosure with more suitable habitat, essentially rock piles protecting their burrows. And again, an enclosure to help protect them from predators. So that's upcoming, hopefully this summer. But again, we're still in the planning phases of it at this point.
I have one more question. How much area do the burrowing owls need, like per burrow, whatever section? Like, could they be reintroduced someplace as small as the Amon Basin, for example, because it's safe, supposedly, unless kids come with BB guns, which is what happened in this area before.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
So each burrow site, one site being a cluster of 3 burrows, is fairly small. Jason, I don't know if you know the details. I know you are pretty extensive in your knowledge with burrowing owls as well. But just a single site is pretty darn small. I don't know as far as their larger habitat needs, what that would consist of. So if they were looking at doing a single site in an area, what they would need above and beyond that for habitat, hunting, and food supply. Do you know, Jason?
Yeah, it'll come down in part to food availability, and how much space they're going to need to hunt, because unlike almost all other raptors or owls, I mean, these, like you mentioned in your slideshow, these guys have like 8 to 11 like young in a nest, which is crazy. So when you got 13 owls to feed for one pair, it takes they great service for rodent control. But we typically space clusters at least, I want to say it's 200 meters apart. That's spacing to give one pair enough space for a territory. But they are in some ways, because they have evolved with in areas with a lot of colonial mammals like ground squirrels and prairie dog towns and things like that. They aren't as defensively territorial, but they do maintain their own territory. So it would really depend on the habitat, but I guess, a couple hundred, a diameter of maybe 200 meters would be suitable. I don't have information on their foraging distances though, so.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you both. And we had one more question that did come in. This one came from Vicky. Vicky asks, how are the bats doing? You mentioned white nose syndrome.
So currently we've never detected white nose syndrome in Benton County, Franklin County, the area I serve. We've tested the maternity colony on Hanford, and they've all come back negative in the past. We have, this is a ongoing issue in Washington. White nose syndrome a few years ago was detected and started in King County and has spread to a few counties more recently. How susceptible which species of bat in our area will really kind of yet to be seen. Bats, as a whole, white nose has really been detrimental and devastating to the population. So currently the bats at Hanford we haven't really detected a decline or white nose there, and hopefully we won't. They might be in a warm enough kind of climate that maybe is, yeah, I don't know, a lot of speculation there, but so far they're doing okay locally.
Awesome. Trina, did you have anything to add to Jason? Awesome. Okay, well, I think now we're starting to be rounded down. I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, although I will share this one question this one comment that came in, since you guys can't see the Facebook feed. This comment came from Norma, and Norma just said, big thanks to each of the presenters for your well-organized and informative presentation. I appreciate the partnering organizations, agencies putting this together and helping the public understand the decline of the steppes habitat and the animals that depend on it. I hope we do see the development of restorative approaches to save these amazing lands and habitats. And we couldn't agree with you more, Norma. So thank you so much for your comment. I think on that, I had one more comment I was going to make. If you go on the Facebook chat, you'll see the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and all sorts of amazing comments that provide links to a bunch of other to different resources that mentions the wildlife and habitat that was presented today by Jason and Trina. So if you have time, feel free to check out our Facebook live stream comment thread, and you can see all those fantastic links and resources. And I think earlier on, we made a tribal land acknowledgement at the beginning of the presentation, and I think I didn't catch the beginning of it because I was working on the live stream stuff, but it's come to our attention that we left out Wanapum. We'd like to make sure that we remember Wanapum as well with that land acknowledgement that Ginger made. So I guess with that, I'm seeing if we have any more questions that came in. I don't see any more questions. Ginger, do you want to start closing this out then?
Well, thanks for whoever caught the Wanapum. We have the differentiation between treaty tribes and non-treaty tribes, and I do try to remember to include the Wanapum because they are the closest physical tribe to the Hanford site. And I would agree with, I think it was Norma. Excellent, guys. Really wonderful presentation. Very interesting. And I like that you focused on just a few species because that gives us an opportunity to come back and focus on different species in the future. So I hope that you'll be amenable to that. And thank you so much, Trina and Jason. And I think that's it. Ryan? Anything else?
I guess before we close out, I'll say that I don't think currently we're planning to do a event in November or December because of the holidays. So stay tuned for the new year for when we start holding these events again. I think our plan that we discussed earlier today is we're going to kind of hold a supersized January, where at the beginning of the month we're going to have a Let's Talk About Hanford event, and then at the end of the month we're going to hold another one. And I think the plan potentially for the beginning of January is to hold an event that kind of highlights ecology's work with Hanford over the previous year. So, kind of a year in review, so to speak. So look forward to more information about that. And I guess with that, we can see if Jason and Trina have any parting thoughts, and then we can let everybody go for the night. Trina, do you have any final thoughts?
Gosh, I just want to say thanks to you and the team at Department of Ecology for putting this together and reaching out to me. This was great. Appreciate it. Great questions. And too, if folks want to get a hold of us, I think our information was listed on the website, or at least on the closing slide. So please reach out with any questions anytime. Thanks to all of you.
Awesome.
Yeah, likewise. No, thanks. I hope everybody gets a chance to go out. If you haven't explored, part of the Reach Monument, it's a really great place to explore, and you may be surprised that yes, it's not all a nuclear wasteland or whatever the the comment came in as. So appreciate sharing that information, and thanks everybody. Thanks for putting this on.
Alrighty, and with that, we'll go ahead and close out the event tonight. I'll remind everybody that the recording will be available up on Facebook. It depends. Depends how long it takes to buffer, but it'll be available pretty immediately for folks to review it if they want. And it should also be up on our YouTube channel tomorrow if you want to see the recording of this event. And of course, you can catch all of our other previous events on Facebook and YouTube as well. So with that, hope everybody has a good night, and thank you so much for attending tonight's event.